Why does modern life feel so shallow, reactive, and false? Well, part of the answer is that most people are conditioned to decide what something means before they've actually even really taken it in. Now, in this video, I'm going to break down that pattern, show you how it works, and explain what it costs us when interpretation replaces contact. And if you've ever felt like people are constantly misreading each other or misreading you, stay with me. There's a way of moving through life where something's encountered and almost immediately turned into a conclusion. Before sufficient interaction has taken place, it's already been interpreted, categorized, and meaning has been assigned, like what it is, whether it's beneficial, if it's worth taking seriously, whether or not it's valid. This can happen so quickly, it doesn't feel like a decision. It feels normal. It can even feel like awareness. But there's a difference between what's actually there and what's already been concluded about it. Most of the time, that difference gets smoothed over before it's even noticed. Once something has been decided, the rest of the interaction starts organizing around that decision. Attention, tone, and behavior all follow it. So what registers and what gets filtered out follows it too. At that point, the person's no longer interacting with what's actually in front of them. They're interacting with their determination of it. You can see this in very ordinary moments. So let's say you're telling someone that something they said felt off to you, and you want to talk about it. Now, before you've even finished the sentence, they're already defending themselves. They explain what they meant, they correct your read, they tell you that you misunderstood. All of that happens before they ask a single question or show that they understand your concern. They're responding to their story about what you're saying instead of responding to you. That's the shift. And this isn't occasional, it's constant. It shows up in how feedback is heard, how pain's interpreted, how behavior is judged, and in how difference is processed. Now, something appears, and the first thing we do is to decide what it means and whether it counts. Now, this becomes so normalized it passes as discernment. But deciding something is not the same thing as actual contact. And when deciding replaces contact, something else shifts. Dignity is no longer inherent. It becomes conditional. Attention and care become conditional. At that point, those are no longer responses shaped by the fact that something real is being encountered. They're responses to what we've already determined about it. And because that determination happens without enough contact, what's being responded to is not the thing itself. It's a construction made from fragments, assumptions, pattern recognition, and prior conditioning. The response can feel accurate, justified, and even obvious, but that doesn't mean it's grounded in reality. This is part of how people can behave in ways that would otherwise register as harmful and still experience themselves as reasonable while doing it. The behavior aligns with what's already been decided, and the decision defines what now feels appropriate. Now, what might register as dismissive in one moment can feel justified in the other if the other person has already been interpreted in a way that makes that treatment make sense. We've all experienced this in subtle or overt ways, and this doesn't depend on everyone valuing the same things or living the same way. People can value completely different things and still be engaged in the same basic act. One person can decide something's impressive, another can decide that same thing is ridiculous. One can see value, another can see none. But in both cases, the same thing's being done. Something's being decided without sufficient interaction, and everything else follows from that. That's part of what makes modern life feel so shallow and reactive. A lot of what passes for perception isn't really perception. It's contact being replaced by conclusion, and the cost of that is no small thing. Because if you live in a world where people are constantly responding to what they've already decided, then real relational engagement becomes rare. Listening remains underdeveloped. Reception toward another is atrophied. Even self-knowledge becomes harder because you're not only dealing with your own patterns, you're also living inside of other people's readings of you and then having to deal with that. A lot of people know what it feels like to be in the middle of explaining something and realize that the other person has already built a story about you, and now they're listening through that. They've already chosen the frame through which everything else is now read. And once that happens, the conversation's not really relational. Words may still be exchanged, the interaction may still continue, but contact has already narrowed. To be clear, I'm not saying human beings should never assess anything. We do assess. That's not the problem. The problem's not that interpretation exists. The problem is when our read of something displaces contact with the other person. That's where distortion enters. Because once we're responding to our own patchwork of reality instead of what's actually here, we're no longer participating in reality with very much integrity. We're participating in a version of reality that's already been filtered through our assumptions and conditioning. And most of us have been conditioned this way so thoroughly that it feels normal. It doesn't feel like a distortion. And that's part of why it's so hard to see this. But even seeing it doesn't automatically change it. And once you begin to notice this, you'll probably also begin to notice how often you do it. You'll see it in other people, yes, but if you're honest, you'll also start finding it in yourself. You'll notice how quickly you rush to know what's going on, how quickly you decide what's valid and what isn't. And the point isn't to resolve this immediately. The point is to begin recognizing the pattern clearly enough that something else becomes possible. Because if you can't notice the moment where contact is being replaced, then you can't stay with what's in front of you long enough for anything more real to happen. That's the threshold. Not never concluding, but being able to notice when you've moved out of contact and into determination, and to feel how compelling it is. Really beginning to understand that what passes as knowing is often the kiss of death for curiosity. Real participation in life requires more than insular assessment. It requires more than becoming better at deciding what things mean. It requires the capacity to stay with what's in front of you long enough for you to actually understand it on its own terms. That's where I want to begin. Because most people aren't just suffering from bad conclusions. They're suffering from a whole way of moving in which conclusion has replaced contact. And until that's seen, what we think of as insight is really just a sophisticated camouflage for our disconnection. Insight can be powerful, but it's not actual transformation. Transformation requires training. Inside the inner sanctum, you'll enter structured training for changing how you perceive, respond, and participate in this hot and holy life. Join us inside the temple. Links in description.